Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for our first daily dose of Innistrad Crimson Vow spoilers, and oh my god, we have so many cards to talk about. Seriously, we got vampires and planeswalkers and new mechanics. We got like a million cards. It's gonna be a long one, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking about sweet new cards. But before we do, two quick reminders. Number one, if you want to see all the latest previews, you can check them out over at MTGpreviews.com. Sortable, filterable, updated throughout the day. So make sure to check that out if you're interested. Also, a shout out to our sponsor, Card Kingdom. If you need to buy any of these cards or pre-order Innistrad Crimson Vow, you can do that over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Even get a free goldfish sticker. Let them know you want one. They'll hook you up. They're super awesome like that. So thank you to Card Kingdom for supporting the show. And without further ado, let's talk these amazing Innistrad Crimson Vow spoilers. Alright, so first up today, we have the return of Sorin looking better than ever. In our first planeswalker from the set, Sorin the Mirthless. So 4 mana, 4 loyalty, +1. Look at the top card of your library. You may reveal that card and put it in your hand. If you do, you lose life equal to its mana value. -2, make a 2/3 black vampire creature token with flying and lifelink. -7, 13 damage to anything, and you gain 13 life. And I think that Sorin is a pretty powerful planeswalker. I don't think it's broken or bannable or anything like that, but I think this is a card that when you really dig into what it does, has a lot of potential to see play in standard. So first, let's look at these abilities. The +1, it's like a safe Dark Confidant. You get the same ability every turn, drawing an extra card at the cost of life, but Sorin gives you the option. You get to take a peek at the card first. If you got an Emrakul or something expensive on the top of your deck, you can choose not to put it in your hand and not lose that life. Although if you're building a Sorin deck, you're probably gonna have a lot of cheap stuff, so Sorin can be the top end of your curve, drawing an extra card every single turn, Dark Confidant style. Plus the -2 ability, it gives you like a almost Vampire Nighthawk, missing out on the Death Touch, but still a 2/3 flying lifelinker is a pretty reasonable creature, and it helps you gain back the life for the +1, so then you can draw more cards. And then the ultimate, kind of like a powered up Sorin's Vengeance, essentially getting 13 damage for the Innistrad motif of the unlucky number 13. Not guaranteed to win you the game, but still likely to win you the game most of the time. That's a 26 life swing. If your opponent's at 13 or less, you just win the game. Otherwise, you buff your life total, put your opponent low on life, and win with the vampire tokens or whatever. So Sorin, I think the big reason to be excited about Sorin, actually there's two big reasons. One is planeswalkers with a plus loyalty ability that draws a card are traditionally very playable. Look at Nigel Bolas, Ob Nixilis, Jace Wielder of Mysteries, Teferi Hero Dominaria, Jace Memory Adept. All these cards have plus abilities that draw a card, and all these cards have seen a decent amount of play in standard, and many were staples, like Teferi, Ob Nixilis, Jace Memory Adept, Nicole Bolas to some extent. So a plus ability that draws a card, that's a good starting point for a playable planeswalker. Of course, Sorin, it's not quite draw a card because of the life loss. In theory, the decks that are going to play this should be able to draw a card with it pretty much all the time. There will be situations where you get low on life and you can't afford to do it, but really most of the time it's going to be plus draw a card. So we're already starting off good with Sorin in terms of being playable. The other reason to be hyped about this is think about that -2 ability. The -2 make a vampire. What would that card cost? Let's say there was just a creature that Wizards printed that was a 2/3 vampire with flying lifelink. I know it's not quite Vampire Nighthawk, but I still think that that as a creature would probably cost 3 mana. I can't imagine a 2/3 flying lifelinker for 2, even in Power Creep 2021 world. So you're paying essentially 1 more mana for Sorin than you would pay for the creature that its -2 makes, and you get all this upside. You get the plus to draw cards, you get the ability to make multiple vampires in a row if you want to, you get the chance of ultimating. So when you add all that together, I think that Sorin has a lot of potential in standard. I think there's a decent chance that we're going to be seeing Sorins in vampire decks. That's one obvious home. If you're playing vampires, you maximize the power of the -2 when the vampire creature token it makes. But really, this could just be a card in mono black sacrifice decks or the Golgari sacrifice decks where you're just playing this as a value card. You're making a token, you can sacrifice if you need to, you're drawing extra cards, which is exactly what you want to do. You're getting it back with Blood on the Snow. So I could see like the LOL Shambling Gas style decks wanting Sorin as well. I will say, say, in older formats, it's no Sorin Imperious Bloodlord. I don't think you're replacing Sorin Imperious Bloodlord in your historic or modern or pioneer vampire deck with Sorin the Mirthless, so I think it's mostly limited to standard, although who knows, maybe there's some weird black aggro deck that wants on the top end of the curve Dark Confidant style in formats like Historic that don't have access to actual Dark Confidant. But I do think in Vampire Tribal in specific outside of standard, Sorin the Imperious Bloodlord is just so good. I don't think Sorin the Mirthless will beat it out, but this is a really sweet card. I think that Sorin the Mirthless, definitely not a broken Planeswalker, but it really checks all the marks of a playable Planeswalker. Card advantage, protecting itself with tokens, an ultimate that doesn't quite immediately win the game, but should essentially win you the game. So I think we'll be seeing a decent amount of Sorins in our new standard format. We also got the bride-to-be, Olivia Crimson Bride. So we know the whole story of Crimson Vow is about Olivia marrying Edgar Markov. Well, we got the Olivia card, and it is a pretty scary one. 6 mana, 3/4 legendary vampire noble. It has flying and haste. When it attacks, you get to reanimate a creature card from your graveyard, tapped and attacking, and it gains, if you don't control a legendary vampire, you exile. So you get to permanently reanimate a creature as long as Olivia or another legendary vampire sticks around on the battlefield. This card is really scary. I tried to find some good comparisons for this, a creature that reanimates when it attacks, and I really couldn't find many. We got Drana, which is like a super watered down version of Olivia where your opponent gets to choose what you reanimate. We got stuff like Alicia, which kind of does the same thing but costs mana and has a big power restriction, so you can't just reanimate anything. Olivia doesn't care. This can get back any massive creature with its attack trigger, and it's going to smack your opponent right away. This offers the potential for a ridiculous amount of damage. You're hitting for 3 with Olivia, plus you're getting to hit right away with whatever creature you got. The only drawback is, if you aren't playing a deck with other legendary vampires, if your opponent kills the Olivia, you are going to lose what you reanimated too, but really that creature was a free roll. You got it back without spending any mana with Olivia anyway. It's worth mentioning that we're in Innistrad standard, and we got a ton of ways to fill the graveyard, but we got a new way coming in Innistrad Crimson Vow as well with blood tokens, as we see with Voldaren Estate, which is a pretty sweet land anyway for vampire decks. It's essentially your personal city of brass, but blood tokens, they're kind of like clues, except they only cost 1 mana to sacrifice, and rather than just straight up drawing you a card, you discard a card and then draw a card. So this is a way you can fill your graveyard, and Voldaren Estate is a vampire card anyway. It gets cheaper to make the blood tokens if you have a bunch of vampires, so you can potentially be making it for like 0 mana, which is kind of absurd. And then, even though drawing a card is better than rummaging, if you're playing some sort of reanimator deck, like with Olivia, then rummaging is kind of insane, because this is a way you can get your big expensive things into the graveyard without first casting them. But even outside of blood tokens, we got so many ways to get cards in the graveyard. That's what Innistrad's all about. We got things like Consider, we got Thrilling Discovery, you can learn and choose not to get a lesson from your sideboard to rummage, we got Moonveil Regents, Falconwrath Pit Fighter, Old Stick Fingers. So there are plenty of ways to support Olivia in vampire decks, in reanimator style decks, in just generic mid-range style decks. There's so many ways to fill the graveyard that I'm actually pretty high on Olivia's potential. Even though it doesn't have an ETB, the combination of flying and haste means it does hit right away and get that first creature back. Obviously, the dream is you discard a Coma or a Belladro, some massive creature that is essentially going to win the game on its own, and Olivia can get it back, and you certainly can build a deck that's trying to do that. We were talking about the blood tokens, like you can discard your Coma, attack with Olivia, get back the Coma, and probably just win the game, but I don't even think you need to do that for Olivia to be good. Just getting back things with combat damage triggers, like Westgate Regent to get huge, or a Freak Frame Painter seems good. Even just getting back random evasive vampires, like get back a Nighthawk Scavenger, smash your opponent for 8 damage or something, or an Image Trumpeter, or a Drana Last Blood Chief, which doesn't trigger right away. Worth mentioning, Olivia puts a creature into play tapped and attacking. That means attack triggers like Drana aren't going to work with Olivia the first turn, because Drana would come into play with Olivia already attacking, so it's not going to attack. Combat damage triggers, as we were talking about before though, like Westgate Regent, a Freak Flame Planer, those do work. The other thing is we got a decent amount of legendary vampires in standard that you probably would want in a vampire deck anyway. Valentine, Florian, maybe Drana, which hasn't really proven itself to be good enough, but this gives us additional ways to keep the creature around. The only downside of being like Olivia Reanimator is your opponent kills the Olivia, and then you don't have another legendary vampire, you lose everything else as well, but throwing some some more legendary vampires into your deck will greatly power up Olivia and make sure those creatures stick around. It's also a pretty sweet card to put into play off Sorin in older formats. Like Sorin, put this into play on turn 3, maybe discard something to a Faithless Looting, let's say, on turn 2, and just get back some huge vampire and take over the game. That seems like it has potential. I also think that Olivia has a lot of commander potential. In Commander, we got tons of ways to tutor our best creatures into the graveyard, Entombs and Buried Alives, and then we got some really powerful reanimation options, getting back like Hellkite Tyrant to steal all your opponent's artifacts with its combat damage trigger, or Lord of the Void to steal a creature. Even a Dockside Distortionist, things with Enter the Battlefield triggers to make a bunch of tokens seems pretty powerful. I think the most exciting thing, though, is creatures that give you extra combat steps. Imagine playing an Olivia deck in Commander and getting back a Port Raiser, smashing your first opponent, getting an extra combat, and that lets you attack with Olivia again to reanimate something else, maybe like a Morag, and then you get more combats, and you just kind of snowball that into a victory. So I think at Olivia, it's a really solid card. I think it's got a chance in Standard. It's the top end of a vampire deck. It's the top end of some sort of mid-range deck, and probably a fun build around Commander with a vampire reanimation madness theme as well. Next up, we got some cards showing off our mechanics from the set, starting with Voldaren Bloodcaster / Bloodbat Summoner. So Voldaren Bloodcaster, it is a double face card, and we knew that was returning. That's kind of Innistrad thing, but this shows off the blood token mechanic. We talked about it a little bit before with the land when we were talking about Olivia, but this really shows off what the card can do. So Voldaren Bloodcaster, 2 mana, 2/1 Vampire Wizard. It is flying. When it or another non-token creature you control dies, you get to make a blood token. And a blood token, it's an artifact with pay 1, tap it, discard a card, sack it, draw a card. So essentially pay 1, sack it, and you get to rummage. And then when you create a blood token, if you have 5 or more blood tokens, you get to transform Bloodcaster into Bloodbat Summoner, a 3/3 flyer that at the beginning of combat on your turn turns a blood token into a 2/2 hasty flying bat creature token. So essentially giving you 5 power to attack with your 2-drop. I actually think this card is kind of insane. Discounting blood tokens, which I'm sure we'll talk about more as we go along, it just as a standalone card, Voldaren Bloodcaster is really good in an aggressive deck. A 2 mana 2/1 flyer, that's already fine. It has an ETB trigger where you're getting this blood token, so even if it dies, you're getting some value right away. And then if you flip it, you're hitting for 5 in the air every turn, thanks to turning this somewhat useful blood token into a bat. So I feel like if you compare blood tokens to clues, at first glance they might seem bad. Clues, of course, 2 to sacrifice, you straight up draw a card. The upside of clues is they generate card advantage, and that's really huge in some decks. However, don't think of blood tokens as strictly worse clues. They do different jobs. They have a bunch of upsides. One is they only cost 1 mana. It's half the price to sacrifice a blood token compared to a clue. Secondly, you might want to get cards in your graveyard, and I think that's the main use of blood tokens, other than turning them into bats, obviously. But I think that's the main use. We have a lot of mechanics in Innistrad that care about getting cards in the graveyard. Vampires have mechanics like Madness that care about cards being discarded. Blood tokens are a really cheap, efficient way for you to discard a card, to reanimate it in the future, maybe with Olivia, or to Madness it into play at a discount. And I feel like blood tokens are going to be a little bit underrated at first. I actually think they're insanely powerful, and they might actually be on the power level of clues, even though they work a lot differently. So as far as Voldaren Bloodcaster itself, I feel like this is probably going to make it in the vampire deck in Standard. In Standard, we got Vampire Socialite, which is a little bit hit or miss because you got to deal damage to your opponent to turn it into like a pseudo lord, but it's a reasonable 2-drop. Beyond that, you got Bloodthirsty Adversary, which is fine, but better at 5 mana. Slaughter Specialist that you really got to build around. All this to say, there's not a ton of competition in the Vampire 2-drop slot, and I would be surprised to find that Voldaren Bloodcaster is not good enough. As we talked about before, it is something right away making the blood token, and then if you flip it around, which doesn't seem that difficult over the course of a game, it's actually a pretty legitimate threat hitting for 5 in the air. But there might even be a better home for it than Vampires, which is the Sacrifice style decks. We have several Sacrifice style decks in Standard using Shambling Gas and Eye Twitches and Deadly Disputes. Voldaren Bloodcaster seems insane in these decks. It gives you the blood tokens that you can use for filtering. Plus, you're going to be sacrificing stuff anyway, and you get an on-curve threat, so you're quickly going to flip around and can use Bloodbat Summoner as your like pseudo finisher. So I think this is an easy inclusion in sacrifice decks as well. So that means there's multiple homes for this card. It might look like an innocent little 2-drop, but it actually has a lot of power. The one place where it's bad is with Decay, because remember, Voldaren Bloodcaster specifically says non-token creatures. When I first read it, I kind of missed that, and I was thinking, oh, this will be sweet with Decay. I can like play Jadar and attack with the fake Decay zombie, and it'll die, and it'll trigger Voldaren Bloodcaster, and then I can rummage, but that's not going to work. So keep that in mind. It does require you to have non-token creatures, but even with that bit of a drawback, I think that this is a really good card. Once you get back to older formats, historic, modern, then you have all these madness vampires. And as I mentioned before, blood tokens are insane support for a madness deck, giving you an instant speedway for 1 mana to discard a card and then madness it into play at a discount. Your Bloodhall Priest, or your Asylum Visitor, or whatever if you got Falconwrath Gorger out. So if you're playing like Anje Falconwrath in Commander, I feel like this is going to be not just a good card, but maybe one of the best cards in your deck. You're like able to make these tokens that just really support your madness plan super well. So I actually really like Voldaren Bloodcaster as a card, and I really like blood tokens. At first I thought, okay, like they're kind of bad clues, but the more I think about all that they can do, I'm not even sure they're worse than clues. They might be similarly powerful to clues, but just for a different deck. If you care about just raw card advantage, clues are obviously going to be better, but if you care about the graveyard and you care about madness synergies, then blood tokens might actually just be an upgrade over clues. As crazy as that sounds, because clues are really powerful. We also got the return of Disturb, this time with a twist, shown off by Dorothea, Vengeful Victim, and I actually really like this card. I really like the Disturb mechanic as well, and it needed more support. We played it a little bit on stream, and it felt close, and I think that getting another set full of support, maybe that puts it over the top. So the twist this time around is that our Disturb cards are coming back as auras rather than creatures. So Dorothea, front half, a 2-mana Azorius 4/4 with flying, that when it attacks her black, she got to sack it at the end of combat, and then you can disturb it into play from the graveyard as Dorothea's Retribution, an aura that enchants a creature, and when it attacks, you make a 4/4 spirit with flying that's tapped and attacking, and it goes away at end of combat, and then, of course, if it goes into the graveyard, you gotta exile it instead, so you can't keep reusing it. So I think that this card is actually kind of powerful. If you think about what it is, it's a upgraded Fog Elemental, and Fog Elemental isn't something that's super exciting, but a 4/4 flyer for 2, that's an aggressive clock. Sure, you can only use it one time, but you're smashing in for 4 damage, or essentially stonewalling any creature in the early game. So it's great on defense, and is kind of a weird ball lightning style effect. Also fine on offense, and then once you flip it around, you're literally getting Invocation of Saint Traft. It's the same mana value. You're making the 4/4, rather than an angel, it's a spirit, which isn't a huge difference, but you're essentially upgrading one of your creatures into a Geist of Saint Traft. I feel like this card has a lot of potential. If you look at the Disturb deck we already have in Standard, it's all about getting cards in the graveyard. That's the most powerful thing you can do with Disturb cards. Sure, you can cast them and have them die, but it's even better if you mill them with Devoted Graftkeeper, or maybe you loot them away with Faithful Mending. So you can loot them away and then use them as card advantage by casting them from your graveyard. And I'm imagining in the Disturb deck, you play Dorothea and smash your opponent and then goes to the graveyard, and then you put Dorothea's Retribution on a Benevolent Geist or something and just smash your opponent for 6 in the air and close out the game really quickly. This is going to allow these decks to get off to some really fast starts. Imagine 1-drop into Dorothea, smash you, next turn, stick your enchantment, Dorothea's Retribution, on your 1-drop, smash your opponent again. I think that this is a huge deal for the Disturb deck. And we also have even non-Disturb decks. I could see playing this. We have like blue-white tempo decks, Azorius Tempo. Maybe you just play this as a value card and you just hit your opponent once and then put your Dorothea's Retribution on a Spectral Adversary or whatever evasive creature you have, even Intrepid Adversary, a big lifelinker, to smash your opponent as you're attacking anyway. So I think that Dorothea's Retribution probably has a chance to be pretty good in Azorius-style aggro decks in Standard, either straight up Disturb tribal decks where you're really building out on the mechanic, or just Azorius aggro decks where you're playing Dorothea's Retribution as a finisher. Sure, Invocation of Saint Traft wasn't good enough on its own to really see competitive play, but when you get to cast it from your graveyard and it generates card advantage and it's attached to this big temporary body, I think that might be enough to give it the push it needs to actually be a competitive Standard card. We also got the return of the Exploit mechanic, as highlighted by Overcharged Amalgam. So if you don't know Exploit, basically, when a creature with Exploit comes into play, you can sack a creature. If you do, you get its Exploit ability, Overcharged Amalgam, Oh my god, this might be one of the best cards that we've seen from Crimson Vow so far. 4 mana 3/3 zombie horror with flash and flying and exploit. If you exploit it, when it enters the battlefield, you get to counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. This card, I would not be at all surprised to find this to be one of the most played cards from Innistrad Crimson Vow in Standard. This card is absolutely bonkers. So when you think about this card, its floor is a 4-mana counter spell because you can always exploit it to its own ability. So worst case, everything goes wrong. You really got to stop the Elrond's Epiphany. You can just flash this in, sack it to itself, counter the Elrond's Epiphany. A 4-mana counter spell isn't exciting, but when you consider all the other synergies that build on this card in the exploit mechanic, I actually think this card is going to be bonkers in Standard. So we've seen similar cards in the past. There was Slumguard Sorcerer, which was actually an exploit creature. It only hit creature spells, though, as far as what it countered. Overcharged Amalgam does so much more. Voracious Great Shark, also kind of similar as Stifle. When you think about Overcharged Amalgam in Standard, the first thought is, okay, zombies. It's a zombie card, and it does work well with zombies. It pumps your champion of the parish. It grows from Narfi. You even get some recursion there. You could, like, sack your Narfi and then recast it or put it into play from the graveyard for 3 mana. But where this card is really going to shine is with a specific type of zombie deck, which is the Decay deck. That is why I'm so hyped for this card. We've talked about for the last few months, okay, Decay creatures aren't actually real creatures. You can only attack with them once. They can't block at all. They go away really quickly, but they're amazing sacrifice fodder. And I think that Overcharged Amalgam is designed to work with these semi-functional Decay zombie tokens. So you got your Jadar that's making one every turn. You got your Tainted Adversary. They can make a bunch of them. They turn Overcharged Amalgam into an absurd card. This 4-mana 3/3 flyer, that's already a fine rate, and you're countering something when it comes into play, plus you're sacrificing something that's pretty useless. You sack your Jadar token, you're getting it back anyway, so there's very minimal downside there. So I feel like Wizards very cunningly figured out the perfect return mechanic to kind of power up the Decay cards, which were kind of medium, not really good enough to see a ton of play in our Standard before Crimson Vow. But now that we're getting these exploit cards, I think that Decay in general goes way, way up in value because Decay zombies might be the perfect thing to sacrifice in all of Magic to exploit creatures. So Overcharged Amalgam, it lines up really well with our Standard format. One of the easiest ways to stop Elrond's Epiphany is just to counter it. Overcharged Amalgam not only does that, but it also gives you a clock, assuming you can sacrifice something else. It stops Goldspan Dagon. It gets around Malevolent Hermit because it's not a creature spell, so your opponent can't counter it with Hermit. So I feel like it lines up really well with the metagame. The Stifle ability, I don't know how good that's going to be. Normally when you see a counter target activated or triggered ability, you're thinking about like stifling a fetch land in older formats, but when you really look at the Standard meta, you might get value here as well. Like you stop Ezekiel Chariot tokens, or you stop things from flipping with like Tovolar, or you stop Rangers class from leveling up, or Old Growth Troll from coming back, or a Planeswalker activation. So I think the main use of Overcharged Amalgam is going to be countering that Elrond's Epiphany or Goldspan Dragon, why it's on the stack. There's actually a lot of heavily played cards in Standard that can get got by the other mode, the Stifle mode on Overcharged Amalgam. So I think this card is absolutely insane. I think this is the mechanic we need and the type of card we need to power up the Decay mechanic, to power up zombies. I think there's actually a chance. One of the things I wanted out of Crimson Vow was zombies to be playable in Standard, and while it might not be the most traditional, like play a bunch of Lords tribal beatdown plan, I think that Exploit plus Decay has the makings to be a really powerful strategy in our new Standard format. Next up on our mechanic list, we got Training, showed off by Savior of Ollenbock. So Training says whenever this creature, a creature with training, attacks with another creature with greater power, put a +1/+1 counter on it. But in the case of Savior of Ollenbock, it does way more than that. So Savior of Ollenbock is a 3-mana 1/2 human soldier. It has training. When it trains, so when you get that trigger, you get to exile up to one other target creature from the battlefield or a creature from a graveyard, and then when it leaves the battlefield, put the exiled cards onto the battlefield under its owner's control. I actually think this card is really powerful. The training mechanic itself is kind of meh. It's basically reverse mentor. Mentor is kind of the same thing, except your mentor creature grows to other creature. So the training mechanic, whatever. We've kind of seen this before, but I think that Savior is actually a very powerful card when you actually think about how it works. So let's think about this card a little bit. Let's say you're playing mono white humans or something in Standard. You play your Savior, you attack with it. You should have a creature that is greater power. Worst case, the absolute worst case is you can exile like a creature from your graveyard and chump attack with your Savior of Ollenbock. And when your Ollenbock dies, your opponent either takes the damage, which I guess is fine because then you're storing up that creature for later. But if it does die in combat, then you get back that creature, hopefully a better creature. You can also use it like a weird attacking Brutal Cathar. Like you're playing an aggro deck, your opponent plays a blocker, you swing in with your team, you use Savior of Ollenbock to get rid of your opponent's blocker to get out of the way and get through even more damage. So this does a whole bunch of things. Like it's like a Brutal Cathar, but you can use it to reanimate your own creatures in a weird roundabout way. You can even use it to sort of save your creatures from a wrath. If you're worried about your opponent wrathing your board the next turn, you can Savior of Ollenbock, your elite spellbinder, let's say, and then when your opponent does wrath and it leaves the battlefield, you're going to get back the creatures you exiled. So even though this might look a little bit weak as a 3 mana 1/2, I actually think that its combination of abilities and its ability to force through damage and be used like an aggro card, but also be used defensively to reanimate your own creatures makes it very, very powerful. Also worth mentioning, the way it's worded, it triggers to return the stuff when it leaves the battlefield, not when it dies. So this means if it dies, the creatures come back. If it gets exiled, the creatures come back. More importantly, if you blink it, the creatures come back. That's another way you can use this. Let's say you're playing a historic deck or a commander deck. You can attack with this, exile something from your graveyard, and then maybe your opponent's got good blocks. You can ephemerate or momentary blink to blink it, get back the creature that you exiled, and keep your Savior of Ollenbock. In standard, you could teleportation circle to every turn, reanimate something, attack. As long as your Savior survives, you exile the creature from your graveyard, and then on your end step, you can blink it, get back the creature that you exiled, and then do it again the next turn and do it again the next turn. So there are certainly shenanigans here. My only concern with Savior, and I think this is a very powerful card, is the 3-drop slot in white in standard is like amazingly overloaded. You got Brutal Cathar, you got Elite Spellbinder, you got Redain, you got Skyclave Apparition, you got Adolin, you get Righteous Valkyrie. There are so many powerful white 3-drops in our current format that it might be that even though Savior of Ollenbock is powerful, it might just get beaten out by other cards that are slightly more powerful. So where this fits in the mixture of all these really strong white 3-drops, I have no idea, but I think that Savior of Ollenbock is a strong card. Worst case, I think it's got potential in other formats, where in Commander, definitely interested in this in Blink style decks like Rune or Brago, also maybe Humans or Soldiers where you can play off the creature type. And then if you go back to like Historic, we got Soul Herder style decks, we got Thassa's style decks, Ephemerates in the format. So those Blink style decks I think could really take advantage of this, forcing through your big Soul Herder for damage, or just using it for Blink value to reanimate your stuff if your Soul Herder dies. So I really like Savior of Ollenbock. Whether or not it can beat out all those other powerful white 3-drops in standard, that remains to be seen, but I think that this is a really powerful card that has some amount of potential for other formats, and I think people might be sleeping on this card a little bit. The initial reaction I've seen from people on social media and on Reddit is kind of like, man, I don't think this card's very good. I think this is a card that is a lot more powerful than it looks when you actually think through all the different things that it can do. We got one more mechanic to talk about with Dig Up. So Dig Up is showing off the Cleave mechanic, and to understand Cleave, we just gotta kind of read the card. So Dig Up, 1 green mana sorcery, says search your library for brackets, basic land card, and then brackets, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. So Cleave says you may cast a spell for its Cleave cost, which is 1 double black and green. If you do, remove the words in square brackets. So if you cast it for its Cleave cost, what Dig Up says is search your library for a card, put it in your hand, then shuffle. If you cast it for 1 mana, it says search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. So I think that Cleave, I like the mechanic. It's another take on Kicker, some way to get extra value out of your spells, some more flexibility. Not sure about the execution, the like putting in brackets and then erasing those words. Not the cleanest way to make this mechanic work. The good news is, I think this card is kind of absurd. Like, this card is so powerful. So when you think about Dig Up, it's basically a Lay of the Land that is also a Diabolic Tutor that requires Golgari mana. But Lay of the Land, just 1 mana, grab a basic land, put it in your hand, then shuffle. Diabolic Tutor grabs anything for 4 mana. Dig Up is a split card that is both of those if you have the right mana to cast it. And we've we've seen in the past that Lay of the Land is not good enough to see play in competitive formats. It's been reprinted multiple times. It's just not good enough. On the other hand, we've also seen that Lay of the Land with upside is usually between very good and even like broken. Attune with the Ether. It might not look like much. It's the same thing. Search for a basic land, put it in your hand for 1 green mana, you get 2 energy. That card was banned in Standard. Traverse the Uvenwald sees play all the way back to Modern, doing the same thing. 1 green mana, search for a basic land, put it in your hand. If you have Delirium, you can search for any land or a creature. I think that Dig Up is the next card in this lineage, and I think this card is going to be incredibly powerful. Part of the upside of these cards is they allow you to trim lands. For 1 green mana, you get a land, so you can cut back on real lands, assuming you have enough basic lands in your deck, and you're buying this upside where in the early turns, you're getting a land and fixing your mana. In the later turns, you're tutoring up anything. Dig Up, I don't know why you wouldn't play this in essentially any deck that you could. In Standard, on turn 1, you snag your forest and fix your mana, or snag a swamp, and then later in the game, you can play the toolbox game and have like 1 Meat Hook Massacre to get you out of trouble if you're about to die. You can grab a Storm the Festival, a Wrenn in 7. If you're any Golgari deck in Standard, I think you want this. Like, I think I would just play this in essentially any style. Aggro decks, mid-range decks, ramp decks, I don't even care. That's how good I think this card is. The only place it suffers as far as 60 card formats is if you're like 3, 4, 5 colors and you just don't have many basics or room for many basics in your deck. Then it gets a little bit worse, but as long as you got enough basics that this can consistently find you a land, this card is absurd. I think it gets even better in Commander. I believe this is just a new ultra staple for Commander decks. I don't know why I wouldn't play this in literally every Golgari deck possible. Like, maybe you're Marin, getting graveyard value. Maybe you're a Gitrog Lands deck. Maybe you're a Lithril Elf Tribal deck. I don't even care. In the early game, it's getting you a land, making sure you hit your land drops. Later, it turns into a Diabolic Tutor. This card is absurd. Like, I feel like this should be 100% in Golgari decks in Commander. So, Dig Up. I really love this card. I think this card is insane. It is incredibly powerful in 60 card formats, maybe even has a chance in formats like Modern and Pioneer, definitely in Standard, and certainly in Golgari Commander decks, where this card is amazing. The mechanic itself, I don't know. I don't know if there's a better way to execute it. The bracket thing is just weird. The way it reads is awkward, but the card itself, undoubtedly one of the most powerful cards that we've seen from Innistrad Crimson Vow. Next up, we have the only card that really matters from today's spoilers, Grolnok the Omnivore, a new legendary Simic frog, a 4-mana 3/3 legendary frog. When a frog you control attacks, mill 3 cards. Whenever a permanent card is put in your graveyard from your library, exile it with a Croak counter on it, and you can play lands and cast spells from among cards you own in exile with Croak counters on them. So this is exciting for a bunch of different reasons. First, it's the first Frog Matters commander that we've ever gotten. There's a couple of legendary frogs like Gitrog, but that's land matters. Yargle, that's just a meme. This is a first legend that actually incentivizes you to put a bunch of frogs in your deck, and I think that's awesome. I love to see the janky, underappreciated tribes of Magic getting more support. It's also a pretty powerful card. Like, if you play a bunch of frogs and attack with this out, you're going to mill a ton, and you're going to be able to cast a ton of cards. Also worth mentioning that the cards exiled with Croak counters are going to stick around. So let's say your opponent kills your Grolnok, you can always recast it and then cast the cards with Croak counters from exile. The other reason I love this card is the flavor. You notice that arm hanging out of the mouth? Well, that's a callback to not only the Gitrog monster, but one of the original Magic frogs in Chubtrode. Apparently, Magic frogs are not good at swallowing a whole person. They're good at eating people, but not quite all of it. There's always an arm hanging out of the mouth. So I love the callbacks to some frogs from Magic's past. As far as building around this card, its power is really kept in check by the fact that frogs in Magic are not very good. Like, the best of them are actually probably Amibian, Froghemoth, maybe Plaxcaster Frogling, and these cards are far from Commander staples. Like, they're not even really especially Commander playable, but in a Grolnok deck, you play a bunch of frogs, you attack a bunch, you're going to draw a bunch of cards, which is good because you're going to need a lot of them. This is the frog weird self-mill version of Toski. What Toski is for squirrels, Grolnok is kind of the same. Wizards has realized when you got a really bad tribe, the way to make that tribe work is let that tribe draw a ton of cards, because you're going to need a lot of frogs to equal up to one good card that your opponent's playing, and Grolnok does get that job done in its own way. You can definitely fill a deck with frogs. I think there's like 32 frogs in Magic. Not all of them are Grolnockable because of their colors, but especially if you expand to cards that have frog in the name or the rules text, like Turn to Frog or Frog Tongue, you can definitely build Frog Tribal. There are enough frogs to get that done, and Grolnok is actually a pretty powerful leader. Worst case case, you can always cheat a little bit, play your Maskwood Nexus or Arcane Adaptation or some Changelings. And remember, Grolnok only cares about permanents being put into your graveyard from your library. It doesn't care how they get there. Obviously, if you're Frog Tribal, you're going to get a lot of cards there naturally by attacking with frogs and self-milling, but you can do this in other ways as well. You could actually not be Frog Tribal Grolnok, and you could just play a self-mill deck with Satyr Wayfinders and Hedron Crabs and Ultra of Dementias, and just plan on playing your commander and using it like an absurd source of card advantage as you aggressively self-mill yourself with non-frog creatures. And I think this ability also gives it some potential outside of the command zone. I can imagine playing Grolnok in the 99 of like Sidisi or Madroltha or Tassiger or other self-mill commanders where you're just playing this as a standalone card where you play it and then hopefully no one's scared of it because it's a 3/3 frog, then you attack with it in self-mill and generate some card advantage. So I think that this card has a lot of potential. The only thing I dislike about it is when I look through the Frogs of Magic, as I said, there's like 32 of them and like maybe 7, almost 25% of the Frogs of Magic are black. The only thing that would have made this better, I think, was if it was a Sultai commander, because then you could play all the Frogs in Magic and get those black ones like Yargle in the deck as well. But I absolutely love this card. This card is sweet. It's got good flavor. It's got good callbacks. It's got nostalgia, and it's actually pretty powerful. Plus, it opens up a brand new tribe that has never had support before in Commander. I cannot wait to build Grolnok Frogs. It's going to be horrible, but I'm going to enjoy every single minute of it. We also got our rare land cycle, which, as we expected, the completion of the cycle this started in Innistrad Midnight Hunt, and this cycle is actually pretty sweet. I have been very impressed with these lands. Sure, they're a little slow. They don't come into play untapped over the first couple turns of the game, but later in the game, they come into play untapped all the time, and they are definitely a big deal for Standard. We've dealt with some pretty bad mana in Standard. It's been unbalanced. Some colors have more duels than others. This is going to even things out in Standard, and they've seen play all the way back to Pioneer. They see play in Historic. They see play in Commander decks. So I'm glad Wizards finished the cycle. It's always annoying when a cycle is started but doesn't get the opportunity to be finished for years and years and years. So a big deal for Standard. Now all the color combinations are going to have equal mana, which is going to open up some color combinations we haven't had before. It's going to increase the odds of being able to be like a 3-color deck or a 4-color deck, which has been really difficult in our current Standard because the mana is not that great. Plus, gives a little bonus for budget lands for Commander players or Pioneer players or whatever. So not like a busted cycle. We're not in the fetch land, shock land realm here, but a solid cycle that I'm glad has been completed. We also got Torens Fist of the Angels, a pretty sweet legendary human cleric. So 3 mana, a Selesnya card. You get a 2/2 with training. So again, if it attacks and you get a creature with higher power, you get a +1/+1 counter on it. The big deal is whenever you cast a creature spell, make a 1/1 green and white human soldier creature token with training. I actually think this is a kind of scary card. So again, it's a 3-drop, but it calls back to like Hero Precinct 1. You're paying +1 mana and going into another color. The upside is previous versions of this in the 2-drop slot have a restriction. Like Hero Precinct 1 wants you to play multicolored cards. We had like a Knight version that when you cast a Knight, you get a 1/1. Torens doesn't care. As long as you cast a creature, you're going to get that human token, and it even has training so it can grow as the game goes along. So the 1/1s are actually going to be 2/2s if you were attacking with other bigger creatures. I don't know how this will work in Standard, just because we've talked about how the 3-drop slot is so cluttered up in some of these white decks, but I could see this being really strong in a deck with like Catilda, Intrepid Adversary. You play Catilda, your tokens are making mana that lets you cast more creatures and eventually cast a huge Intrepid Adversary to pump them if human tribal is a thing. This seems like a kind of absurd payoff because you're just casting a ton of cheap creatures anyway. You're going to flood the board, you're going to train them up and kill your opponent really, really fast by going super wide. I think it even could have a shot back in older formats. I don't think modern humans will probably play it. I don't know. Maybe there's a slight chance as like a 1-of or something. It is powerful in a deck full of cheap creatures, but like Pioneer humans, Historic humans, some of these are Abzan decks already because you want Collected Company. You got a bunch of lords like Thalia's Lieutenant that can grow the tokens, which is a huge upside. Having the tokens be on tribe is a really big deal. You got General Kudrow that can also take advantage of them. It's cheap enough for Collected Company. So if you want to build like human token commander decks, Torens is a pretty sweet commander to lead those decks. And I also think it could be a pretty good constructed card. So we'll have to see how good are humans in Standard. We don't know yet. We'll have to see. Maybe Torens can be that push they need. Catilda is a powerful card, but I think that Torens is certainly of a power level that in the right deck, this card can do a lot of work and be very good. We also got one of the weirder wraths we've ever seen by invitation only. So a 5-mana white sorcery that lets you choose a number between 0 and 13, and each player sacrifices that many creatures. So essentially, this can be a wrath. This can be a 5-mana wrath on almost every board state. It is pretty unlikely that your opponent is going to have more than 13 creatures. I guess maybe in standard you get Scoot Swarmed or something and it doesn't get rid of all the creatures, but most of the time, this can be a hard sweeper if you want it to be, but it has some weird upside. So think of this as a Doomscar, and I don't think this beats out Doomscar in standard. The foretell ability on Doomscar is really, really good, but there is upsides here. This is a wrath that can get rid of indestructible creatures, for one, because it's forcing each player to sacrifice creatures rather than just destroying them. So getting rid of indestructible stuff, that's one upside. The other upside is you can potentially manipulate this in a way where you're wrecking your opponent's board, but keeping some of your stuff. Let's say you're playing a white weenie deck, or maybe an Orzhov deck in standard that's going wide with Clarion Spirits, going wide with Sedgemoor Witch. You can probably build a big board of tokens, and when you cast by invitation only, you can pick a number equal to the number of creatures your opponent has and get rid of their Coma, get rid of their Goldspan Dragon, choose 3 or 4, while you just sacrifice some random tokens that you don't really care about and keep your good stuff to rebuild the next turn. So I don't think this is strictly worse than something like Doomscar, even though control decks, I think, are most likely going to stick with Doomscar, even though getting rid of Coma is an upside. Those indestructible creatures we were talking about. In the right deck, I could see this being a sideboard card for go-wide decks, where you can choose a number that gets all your opponent stuff, but still leave some of your good stuff on the battlefield. And the same goes for Commander, where indestructible creatures are even more of a concern. And in your like go wide human deck or something, this might be one of the best wraths or pseudo wraths available for you. We also got a weird twist on a new tutor with pretty amazing art from Sam Gay, Demonic Bargain. So 3-mana sorcery, exile the top 13 cards of your library, then search your library for a card, put that card in your hand, and shuffle. So Demonic Bargain, it's kind of a Grim Tutor or a Demonic Consultation. Those are probably the two closest comparisons. Essentially, without any loss of life, you can tutor up any card from your library for 3 mana, which seems pretty powerful, but there's the risk that maybe you exile the card that you need, or just eat away too much of your library. Casting 2 or 3 of these in your game and you're going to eat away your entire deck. So I'm really not sure how good this card is. I think that in a vacuum, in a generic deck, let's say we're playing Commander, I think I would just play Diabolic Tutor over this. I think I would just play a Grim Tutor over this. I don't think that it's going to be worth it, because especially in Commander, where you have a singleton deck, let's say the worst case is you cast this and exile the card you're trying to find, which will happen, what, like 16, 20% of the time. It depends on how many cards are in your deck, obviously, but with a pretty full deck, there's not super high chances, but that can happen. The other problem is, if you're playing a singleton deck, even if you don't exile the card you're tutoring for, you could exile your finishers or your combo pieces, and it's hard to get stuff back from exile. So I think in a generic deck, in a vacuum, I would play a more expensive Diabolic Tutor over Demonic Bargain. However, there are certain decks that exiling stuff can be an upside. Maybe you're using this with Crackling Drake to get cards in exile and grow it. Maybe you're trying to get Eternal Scourges and Mist Hologriffins, which you can cast from exile into your exile zone. Then Demonic Bargain all of a sudden becomes really, really good. The other possibility is maybe you're trying to empty your library. Maybe you're playing a Laboratory Maniac deck, or Thassa's Oracle deck, or Jace Wielder of Mysteries deck, and you play this and copy it a couple times and exile your entire deck and find your Thassa's Oracle and win the game. Like, that could be a thing as well. So I see this not so much as a generic tutor that I would play in any deck, but a combo piece for these weird brew around Exile Matters style decks. So I think as far as standard is concerned, I don't know, Grim Tutor didn't do anything. I don't expect this to really do anything either. I'm not even sure it's an upgrade over Grim Tutor when you actually think through everything that happens when you cast this card, but there are certain decks that are going to love this card, and it's really cool to see a tutor that supports them. We also got one of my favorite cards from the set, the Return of Anje, Anje, Maid of Dishonor. So a 4-mana Rakdos Legendary Vampire. You get a 4/5 for 4, and it says whenever it or one or more vampires enters the battlefield under your control, create a blood token only once each turn. The blood token, we already talked about it. You can pay 1 and discard a card and sack it to draw a card, and then you can pay 2, sacrifice another creature or a blood token to drain each opponent for 2. Each opponent loses 2, you gain 2. Anje, bear with me for a minute, and you're probably going to yell at me and say this is way off base. I think this is like Vampire Siege Rhino. When you think about it, 4 mana 4/5, exactly Siege Rhino stats. Sure, Siege Rhino drains for 3 right away, but Anje has the upside that you can potentially drain for 4 or 6, or drain repeatedly turn after turn. It does cost mana, but I think there's a comparison here. Like, a 4 mana 4/5 is a good body, and then you have this reach ability and this life gain ability that's going to help against aggro. We're going to close out the game against control in mid-range. So I actually think Anje is a pretty good standard card. This is one of the vampires I am personally most excited to play in standard. It also has the ETB ability, where at least you're getting the blood token, even if your opponent kills it right away. So maybe it's not quite Siege Rhino, but I don't think it's as far off as Siege Rhino as you might be thinking right now. In standard, we already got a pretty sweet curve for vampires. You got the Falkenrath Pit Fighter, you got the Florian, you got the Olivia Crimson Bride, which we'll talk more about Sisters of the Undead in a minute. So we got ways to build a vampire tribal deck. The other thing that Anje does is huge for vampires. One of the biggest issues with vampires is many of the best ones have a Florian-like ability, where you need to hit your opponent for damage or make them lose life for them to do anything. Like, Florian cares about how much life your opponent lost. By itself, it's just a 3/3 for 3. Not very exciting, but when you're digging through your deck and drawing extra cards, it's great. And a lot of the best vampires from Innistrad Midnight Hunter like that. Anje, with the blood tokens, gives you a way to damage your opponent whenever you want to for just 2 mana by draining them for 2, which is going to turn on your Florian and all your other stuff. So I think if Vampire Tribal is a thing in standard, Anje is going to be pretty much the reason why. The other possibility is just playing this in a sacrifice deck, maybe a slightly vampire themed sacrifice deck, like Immerse from Predator for some reason is a vampire dragon. Put those together, sacrifice your Eye Twitches and Shambling Yes with Meat Hook Massacre out, and then Anje is kind of an absurd finisher. I know free sacrifice outlets are usually best in aristocrat style decks, but when you think about how this works, you pay 2 mana to sacrifice your whatever Eye Twitch to Anje, you get to drain for 2, plus you got your Meat Hook Massacre out, so you're draining for 3. For like 4 mana, you're draining for 6. For 6 mana, you're draining for 9. It seems pretty possible in a sacrifice style deck with Meat Hook Massacre to play Anje, and the turn after you play Anje, just sack enough stuff to essentially burn your opponent out of the game. So I think Anje is actually kind of insane. I'm sure it's got some commander potential too, but this is a card I'm mostly excited for in standard. It's got good stats, it's got a good ability, it supports a tribe that needs help, and it can work in the sacrifice decks. I would be surprised if we weren't seeing Anjes running around in our new standard format. We also got Wedding Announcement / Wedding Festivity. So the front side, 3 mana enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, put an invitation counter on Wedding Announcement. If you attacked with 2 or more creatures this turn, draw a card. Otherwise, make a 1/1 human token. Then, if Wedding Announcement has 3 or more invitation counters on it, transform it into a Anthem. Creatures you control get +1/+1. So essentially, play it in your aggro deck, get some card draw for 2 or 3 turns. Worst case, get a token, and then eventually flip it around into an Anthem. So I feel like when you read this card, you could see how it could be powerful. You're playing like White Weenie, you curve out your Chaplet of Alms into Clarion Spirit, into Wedding Announcement, and then you draw an extra card, and then you draw an extra card, and then you flip it and grow your Spirit tokens. The only problem is, something we talked about earlier, there's like a million good white 3-drops, and it might be that Wedding Announcement, even though you can see the synergies with white aggro and how perfect it is for a deck like that, maybe it just you can't find room with Elite Spellbinders and Redains and Brutal Cathars and Adeline and Skyclave Apparitions. So I think the card is sweet. I think it has a chance to see play. I like the flavor that it's showing off, but whether or not it's going to be super good in standard, we're going to have to wait and see. We also got, this card, Dominating Vampire. If vampires are a thing in standard, I think this card is going to be a big reason why. A 3 mana 3/3 that when it enters the battlefield, you gain control of the creature with mana value less than or equal to the number of vampires you control until end of turn. Untap it, it gains haste. So this is a threaten on a on-curve body. A 3/3 for 3 is a reasonable body. Normally you can't play threatens in your main deck because they're too narrow. And what if you run into the Is It deck that's not playing any creatures and it's a dead card? Dominating Vampire, this can be a 4 of main deck card in Vampire Tribal, because worst case, it's a 3 mana 3/3, which isn't super exciting, but it's certainly a fine card that you can play in matchups where it's bad. And I think this card is going to be pretty strong in standard. We've talked about how vampires, like Vampire Socialite and Voldaren Ambusher and Florian, care about your opponent being dealt damage. They don't really do anything except be underpowered creatures unless your opponent's losing life. Well, Dominating Dominating Vampire, in a sneaky way, is really good at this. You play your vampires, and then you need to be able to attack with them to trigger Florian and Socialites and Voldaren Ambushers. You can play Dominating Vampire to get a big blocker out of the way, get in that attack, make your opponent lose life, turn on all your other stuff. So I think it fits really well with what vampires are trying to do. And plus, just think about this curve. I think this card's going to be kind of a blowout. Imagine, like, just turn 1, Falkenrath Pit Fighter, turn 2, whatever, Vampire Socialite, whatever 2-drop, turn 3, Dominating Vampire, steal your opponent's 2-drop, smash your opponent with everything. That's a huge swing. Your opponent's going to be at like 8 life or something on turn 3. Like, that can be a game-winning line. So I think Dominating Vampire, I know it just looks like a threat on a body, but I think this card, along with the Anje, are going to be the reasons that vampires actually have a chance to be good in standard. And I could see this card being a sideboard card for vampires in older formats as well. In older formats, there's a lot more options. You got Sorin in the 3-drop slot, but I think this could still be a sideboard all-star to bring in creature matchups, get those blockers out of the way, and smash your opponent to death with their own things. We also got one super sweet reprint, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. There were some rumors that Thalia might be turning into a vampire, but apparently it's someone else who's turned into a vampire. Thalia is back in the same as ever. 2-mana 2/1, human soldier, legendary, first strike, non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. This is a card that is a staple of human decks, aggro decks, Taxes decks, all the way back to Legacy and Vintage. This card is a really big deal. It's like a $10 card, the cheapest version, so a good reprint that you're going to want to open. More importantly, I think this card is a really huge deal for fighting Elrond's Epiphany in Standard. We've been talking about Epiphany, how good it is, how annoying it is, how hard it is for non-blue decks to stop. Thalia doesn't just stop Elrond's Epiphany, but taxing it along with all of your opponent's other spells, especially when you add in Elite Spellbinder and you add in Redain and these other white cards that sort of lightly tax on Elrond's Epiphany. I think that might mean that mono white or some sort of human style deck is just the answer to the Epiphany problem. Like, Thalia is a really, really big deal. If you look at the Izzet decks, they're like all spells and hardly any creatures. Some of them are literally no creatures. Sure, Thalia is going to die to removal, but it's going to slow your opponent down a ton as long as it's on the battlefield. And you're going to have probably 4 copies of it and other taxing effects as well. And plus, if you're playing an aggro deck, you don't got to stop Epiphany forever. You got to stop it for a turn or 2 turns to get in a couple more attacks and close out the game. So I think that Thalia, good reprint value-wise and a huge deal for slowing down the Izzet decks in Standard combined with some of its taxing friends. We might actually have like a Death and Taxes style deck in Standard, which is really, really cool. So Thalia, I love this card. It's really good. It's going to show up in humans. It's going to show up in White Weenie. It is going to be a big deal in Standard and get a little value out of your packs if you happen to open it. We also got the return of the Godzilla card style. So you might remember back with Ikoria more than a year ago now, we got our first taste of other IPs in Magic with the Godzilla cards. And in general, people like the Godzilla cards, not like Walking Dead, which were pretty controversial because they were, just skins. They were essentially altars that Wizards made officially. Well, they are returning with Innistrad Crimson Vow, showing off Bram Stoker's Dracula with like flavor text from the books, and it's really, really sweet. So you can see like Thalia as Mina Harker. We got Count Dracula, which is Sorin. And these are box toppers. So if you pick up a box from your local game store, you're going to get one of these. And if you go back and look at the Ikoria ones, some of those are pretty expensive. The high-end ones are like $50-ish, and even many of the cheap ones are like $5, $10, $20. So this is a nice bonus for picking up a box. You're going to hope to snag a Count Dracula Sorin or a Mina Harker Thalia, and these cards will probably have a decent amount of value. So I actually think this is really sweet. If Wizards wants to do these Godzilla-style skins, I'm completely fine with it. I actually really like them, and I'm going to be hoping to open some sweet ones when I crack my boxes. We also got the face cards from the Crimson Vow Commander decks. We get one Vampire deck with Strefin, one Spirit deck with Maleficent. So Strefin, 4-mana, 3/2, legendary vampire novel. It is flying. Beginning your end step, create a blood token for each player who lost life this turn. So up to 4 blood tokens each turn, and then when it attacks, you can sacrifice 2 blood tokens. If you do, put a vampire card from your hand on the battlefield, tapped and attacking, it gains indestructible. And then Maleficent, 7-mana, 4/4, legendary spirit soldier. It costs 1 less to cast for each spirit you control, which is a nice way to get around the command tax, and also just makes it a lot cheaper than it looks. It has flying, and when it or another non-token spirit you control dies or deals combat damage to a player, create a 1/1 spirit token with flying, so it can snowball pretty quickly once it gets on the battlefield with evasive spirits. So Strefin, kind of like Kalia of the Vast, but for vampires, giving you blood tokens to filter through your deck, so it can work as a commander for a madness-style vampire deck. Probably not as good as Anje, but still, it can work for that. And then also a way to sneak vampires into play from your hand. So Strefin, I don't think it's Edgar Markov busted. Thankfully, I don't think anything's Edgar Markov busted, but he is a pretty sweet commander. There's a lot of Rakdos vampire commanders, lots of competition here, but I can certainly see a reason to build around Strefin, being able to cheat big vampires like Necropolis Regent or Malakar Blood Witch or Champion of Dusk into play for free actually seems pretty powerful. Plus, the blood tokens does open up the possibilities of like a madness style deck. Plus, if you want to go really deep, you can always play your Maskwood Nexuses or Conspiracies and turn anything into vampires and just dump the biggest creatures in all of Commander into play for free. So I think Strefin, kind of a medium power vampire commander, but it seems fun to build around. I like how it references the set mechanics, and it does do something different than all the other Rakdos vampire commanders that we've seen so far, which is important because we got a lot of vampire legends. As far as Melisent, I actually really like this card. 7 mana 4/4 doesn't look super efficient, but again, because it gets a discount for each spirit you control, it's going to be a lot cheaper than that, and it helps cheat on the commander tax, and it's going to make a ton of spirits once it gets on the battlefield. We got a bunch of legendary Azoria spirits, but none of them actually really care about spirits. We got like Dennick, which is Disturbed, or Geist of St. Traft is Voltron, Bragos, Blink, Ragnar's like a Foretell card. Melisent's the first Azoria spirit commander that actually actively cares about you having spirits in your deck. So if you want to play a kind of tribal beatdown plan with your Drogskull Captains and Supreme Phantoms, you get all the Spirit Lords and also a bunch of sneaky spirit token synergies. Kind of an unappreciated aspect of the Spirit Tribe is they don't care about tokens. You got like Twilight Drover, which gets massive as you make tokens. Hallowed Spirit makes a bunch of tokens. Phantom General is spirit that pumps tokens. There's even some unique wraths that can make spirit tokens. So I think that Melisent's pretty interesting. It's probably slightly a plant for us returning to Kamigawa, which is super spirit heavy, at least traditionally, but I think it's a pretty fun commander to build around right now, and we really haven't seen an Azoria spirit commander that actually cares about the tribe before. So again, I think both of these are kind of medium power commanders, but they're certainly powerful enough that if you enjoy them, you can build a deck around them, and I like that they managed to do something different than the other commanders in their colors and for their tribes. We also got Wedding Ring, a pretty interesting white artifact, another commander exclusive card. So 4-mana artifact. When it enters a battlefield, if it was cast, target opponent creates a token that's a copy of it. And then it says, whenever an opponent who controls an artifact named Wedding Ring draws a card during their turn, you draw a card. And whenever an opponent who controls an artifact named Wedding Ring gains life during their turn, you gain that much life. So essentially, played fairly, I cast this card. I'm going to have the original copy, and I give Tomer the other copy. And then whenever I draw a card on my turn, Tomer will draw a card. Whenever he draws a card on his turn, I'll get to draw a card. So it's a way you can kind of make friends with one person at the table. Kind of played fairly, almost a group hug card that will curry favor with one player in specific. However, there's shenanigans here, and there's ways that if you build around this a little bit, this can actually be an insane source of card advantage. Imagine you not having a copy of this, just your opponent having one. So you're not giving your opponents cards in life, but your opponent is giving you cards in life every single turn. That's pretty powerful in white. This is draw an extra card every turn at least, and if your opponent draws multiple cards, you get multiple cards. So one way to do this is just sack the original copy. You play Wedding Ring, give Tomer the copy, and then use Oscar to sacrifice it, or use Brea to sacrifice it, or use Oswald to sacrifice it. So that's one easy way to turn this into straight up card advantage. Another option is just give away the other copy. You have your Bizarre Trader, or maybe a Harmless Offering. Give one opponent a copy, and then give some other opponent another copy. Then you're drawing all kinds of cards. Another option is just pick up the Wedding Ring. You can play Wedding Ring, give Tomer the copy, then use Core Skyfisher, or Emancipation Angel, or Shepherd of the Flock to pick up the original, maybe cast it again, and give Richard a copy now, and then bounce it again and give this one to Krim, so everyone has a ton of copies of these tokens and you're just drawing all the cards. So I actually really like this card. I don't think it's great if you just play it fairly. Like in your generic deck, it still benefits you. It's only helping one of your opponents. There's 4 players at the table. 2 players are getting no benefit. You and 1 opponent are getting benefit. So it's not a full-on group hug. Everyone draws an extra card each turn. But I don't know if I would just play this as generic white card draw, because it is helping someone else too. On the other hand, if you build around it, I think this is actually a really cool build around artifact that can be especially good in specific decks. We also got Sigarda's Summonings, 1 more commander exclusive card. 6 mana enchantment. This has creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them, have base power toughness of 4/4, have flying, and are angels in addition to their other types. 6 mana is a lot. 6 mana, you can be true convictioning. You can be pretty much winning the game. Sigarda Summons, I could see playing this in a +1/+1 counter deck. If you're playing Mikaeus or Hamza or Shalai or Anafenza or Leonor, this could be in the conversation. Turning all of your base power and toughness into 4/4s is kind of nice. The only problem is you need a very specific deck. Not only do you need to put counters on creatures, you need those creatures to be small, because if your creature's base power toughness is 5/5, because you played a Lyra, let's say, all of a sudden you're shrinking your creatures rather than growing them, which is not an upside. You don't want to be shrinking your stuff. So you got to be like a go wide token or weenie style deck that's also putting counters on things. And then Sigarda's Summons, I think, is fine. So this card, I think, is a nice flavor card. It's cool to see Sigarda living and being around, so that part is sweet. I could see playing it in very specific commander decks, but in general, there's a lot of white enchantments that are pretty powerful that can come down for 5-6 mana and essentially win you the game. And I think Sigarda's Summons, in most decks, is just going to be a little bit worse than some of the other ones. Finally today, in the world of lower rarity cards, got a couple of interesting uncommons. Fell Stinger, 3 mana, 3/2, Zombie Scorpion, has Death Touch and Exploit, and when it exploits a creature, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. I actually think this card is going to have a big impact on Standard. A 3/2 Death Touch for 3 is pretty fine, plus it's got a ready built home. There's already a lot of black decks that are trying to sack Eye Twitches and Shambling Gas. You play this, you get a good body, you sack something you want to sack anyway, and you get a Sign of Blood out of it. I have a hard time imagining that this won't be a staple of the sacrifice decks in Standard. Really solid uncommon. We also got Geistlight Snare, a 3 mana counter spell that mana leaks. Counter the spell unless its controller pays 3. However, it's 1 less to cast if you control a spirit and 1 less to cast if you control an enchantment. So it can be a 1 mana mana leak or a 2 mana mana leak depending on your board state. So this kind of calls back to Lookout's Dispersal, which is kind of similar but for pirates. Can get down to 2 mana if you have a pirate. Wizard's Retort, hard counter, costs 1 less if you have a wizard, but it's double blue. Geistlight Snare is kind of the same for enchantments and spirits. I think the enchantment part is a little bit odd. You're probably wondering, like, why is enchantment on there? It makes sense for spirits, and it really directly calls back to some of these other tribal counter spells. I think this is because of Disturbed and how the new Disturbed cards are enchantments on the backside and many are spirits on one of their sides. So I feel like the idea is if you have like a Disturbed spirit and then you also have the backside, you can cast this for 1 mana. So it seems like for Standard, support for the Disturbed mechanic, which is our main spirit deck right now, and then probably other spirit decks in the future once we get to Kamigawa. I also think this can show up in older formats, probably not all the way back to Modern, I don't know, maybe in the sideboard, but there's like a mono blue spirit deck in Historic that plays a bunch of counters. This seems absolutely perfect for that. Probably like Pioneer spirits as well. So Geistlight Snare, really solid counter spell for specific decks only. We also got just a ton of lower rarity stuff. You can check it all out over at mtgpreviews.com. Not going to talk about all of it, mostly just for limited only, but it's worth knowing that it exists if you're interested. And whew, that brings us to the end of our ridiculously long, super sweet, amazingly exciting first day of Innistrad Crimson Vow preview. So let me know what you think. What card from today you're most excited about? What mechanic, tribe, theme? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back tomorrow with more daily Innistrad Crimson Vow spoilers. So until then, have an amazing night, everyone. And I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.